Our next keynote should be of particular interest to a lot of us. We have Jose Fuentes over here. He currently is the founder of Savory, but he's done a lot of work in education platforms, and he was earlier the founder of Duolingo, and he'll be sharing with us the story of Duolingo as well as his perspective on education platforms today. So over to Jose.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. So I guess my first question is, who has used Duolingo or a platform similar to Duolingo? Awesome. Who's actually using it right now? Awesome. And who has used it at some point but stopped using it? OK. My presentation's not here? Awesome. So pretty much the way I want to do this is, first I want to talk a little bit about my own experience, really getting the company started. Actually, I left my day-to-day responsibilities last fall, and I moved to New York to get involved in a company that's pretty much redefining food delivery, and it's like vertically integrated. So I really want to talk about this, but first part will be my experience, and then talk about sort of like looking back some of the lessons that I see now that I'm in New York, that I get to spend time with other education companies, and sort of like where these companies are at and where I see these education platforms going to. So the background on Duolingo is pretty much this got started, I guess, at 2009, really with the question of how do you translate massive amounts of content in a way that is both cost efficient and it is time efficient. So the first answer can be, go to the market, hire thousands of professional translators and translate content. Of course, the cost of this is very prohibitive. So the solution, and of course through an iterative process, ended up being, well, what if we can actually teach people languages? And while they do some of the learning, we can transform some of these learning activities into translation activities. So it's literally this idea of being able to kill two birds with one stone. At the time, we weren't sure if this was going to work, because in a sense, it's sort of counterintuitive that how is it possible that someone that doesn't really know a language can actually go ahead and translate content adequately. Fortunately, we were at CMU with a lot of very smart people. And through a process of iteration, we came up with a system that is as good as a professional translation. The only difference, or I guess the two main differences, is that a lot cheaper and a lot faster. So at some point, we calculated that having 1 million people learning a language, we could actually translate all of Wikipedia from English to Spanish in about 80 hours. At the end of 2010, it was a big team, so we had to leave the university and actually turn into a company. That's when we raised our first round of capital and really started thinking more in terms of, this is not research, we actually have to create a viable business. The interesting thing is that we spent, I guess, all of 2010 and part of 2011 thinking that the browser was the future of this company. And we thought, well, at some point we're going to get to develop the tablet application and the phone application. So we got to that thinking that most of the users were literally going to use the experiences primarily coming from the computer, and that they were going to go to the phone or the tablet as a secondary experience. The funny thing was that within 3 weeks of launching the iOS app, it's like half of the traffic was coming directly into the phone. And this was both for returning users and for new users. And then this literally just increased once we opened it up to Android and tablets. So it's kind of funny that we literally went from being, oh, it's the browser is the future, into it's like, oh, actually, no, the browser is the past. And it's really about the application. So in a sense, the company went from being a browser-oriented into being a mobile company. The great thing, of course, which I think differentiates Duolingo from pretty much every other company that I've seen in the educational platform space, is that, in a sense, the company is not in the business of education, right? It's in the business of translation and other types of revenue that can be generated. So in a sense, it's this, the incentives of the company are very aligned with the incentives of the learner. So it's not, the way I always describe it is that it's not like a Rosetta Stone or like a gym, right? Where you buy the membership and they're actually counting on you not showing up. Here's the complete opposite. Here is the company is actually counting on you showing up to be able to translate all this content. So I don't know if you read, but numbers-wise, the company has performed extremely well. Because again, it's free. It's a truly, truly great product. And I guess now let me transition a little bit into my presentation, which is more about how I've seen the evolution of other companies and just the space in general, and sort of like where I see I guess the whole space moving to. This way? So I guess this, I mean, although this says present and future, I think this should be present and speculation because many things are going to change. So this is sort of like a small number of the companies. So I guess these are sort of like my top of mind companies in the space. As you can see, pretty much every type of skill I can think of. I mean, this is not a comprehensive list, but in a sense, pretty much any type of task that can be turned into a platform will be turned into a platform, which is great because that means that any type of knowledge or any type of activity, in a sense, will be commoditized into an education platform. The two main sort of like directions I've seen in the space is one is this more static, meaning video. So it's basically taking the lecture, recording someone giving a lecture, and then you pretty much watch television, and then at the end you take a test. And then there is the part that I think is really where the excitement should be, which is in creating systems in which you actually are not interacting with a video, but rather you're interacting with computer logic. And the computer logic can actually understand how you learn, can react to the way you learn, can motivate how you learn. From the perspective of the user, there's of course the sort of like the global market in the sense that now these platforms, you don't have to sort of like come to Cambridge to have the experience. You can have this experience worldwide. And of course, that goes without saying that that's a big, big, big part of this because most of the growth really is outside of the US, not within the US. And of course, we also have different pricing points. So we have services that go from literally charging you close to a full tuition to services like Duolingo or like Code Academy that actually charge you $0. And of course, the way they're able to do this is because of the business models behind them. In terms of, I mean, as any product has its advantages and there are limitations. I think these are part of the other challenges. One is retention. Because if you think about students, students are really the most irrational consumers that are out there because they pay thousands of dollars or hundreds of dollars for tuition and they actually don't want to show up to class. It's kind of funny, but that's the way it goes. So retention is one of the big challenges. And in essence, I guess 2013 proved to be a year in which a few companies that actually engaged in using their technologies with universities, the engagement rates were very disappointing. And I think that it really points to the fact that the future is not so much in video, it's really all about building platforms where you're actually interacting with a system, and the system is really motivating you to go ahead and like do the learning and come back continuously. The second one, again, is limited interaction. Again, learning is just hard, and when we learn together, it's a much better experience. And that's something that's still being figured out because in a sense, it's still, the experience is you're in front of a screen and it's you by yourself. Sure, there are sort of like chat rooms where we can go and talk. There's a few companies doing sort of like multi-directional video, so along the lines of like Google Hangouts, but they're still limited. And I think the engagement there really is not as great as it could be. And the final thing is accreditation, which is that at the end of the day, you can spend, hours, weeks learning a language, but if at the end you can't really do anything with it in terms of getting a better job or, or actually using that knowledge in a way to certify that you know it, then there are limitations. Then it's more of like, oh, I want to go to Paris, have a good time, and I'm just going to learn a language. But for the majority of the world, actually, if you know a language, for example, you can actually duplicate your income. So there's definitely an argument for accreditation being very important. And actually, Duolingo just announced the test center, that it's all about taking on the TOEFL, which is a test that literally millions of people have to take every year, have to pay a lot of money, but now Duolingo is offering a much better test, shorter, that can be taken anywhere at a price level that's a lot lower than the TOEFL. And just like as a final note, in terms of sort of like where the industry is at, growth is wonderful. Lots of people are wanting to use this. Of course, this is influenced by the fact that Google is doing a great job at giving out all these Android phones. So the growth penetration is just incredible. And finally, there's just a lot of interest from the venture capital space to really invest in these types of products. So that means that although the assumption is most of these companies will fail for many different reasons, there's still a lot of people going into the market and really fighting for a space in the market. And now it's what the future looks like. So this is more my speculation, because I haven't been to the future. So I see that there's going to be success both in the more passive, like the video kind of interaction, but where I think the excitement has to be on is in the interaction space. Because those are really the systems that will be able to react to the way you learn and will be able to give you a much more compelling experience. And I would say the gold standard for this currently is Duolingo. Like if you've used the product, it is a truly engaging product. And part of the reason it's very engaging is that the entire experience is really measured. So every interaction you do within the product is measured, and because of that, it can react to the way you learn. It can learn your learning patterns. So again, I see Khan Academy as having its space and all these other companies that are doing the video interaction, but at the end of the day, like watching television is about like sitting back and enjoying. It's not really about like learning. So there's a space for that, but I'm just not so sure what's the future there for those platforms. And finally, and this is a sort of a reflection of, you have all these companies, but the question is, which part of the segment they really want to go for? It seems that the focus has been more on going for people that have no education. And the reason for this is that, in a sense, it's simpler to say, I'm going to build a platform that takes you from nothing to something. But personally, what I'm more interested in is, how do you take people that have the basic knowledge and really take them and give them an experience that is as good, let's say, as going to MIT or going to whatever institution you hold to high esteem. But this hasn't been figured out, and I would say that the main limitation here is the money, that ultimately good education has historically been expensive because the cost of labor is expensive. So that's one of the big questions to me is, how are these companies, which segments of the market are they going to end up serving? My hope is that, of course, although everyone is going to the have nothing, give me something, I would actually like to see also companies figuring out ways of going from the I have knowledge, but I really want to get an experience that's a lot more sophisticated. And I guess my final slide is, I see ultimately the future of being when we bring back the physical and the digital and we marriage them. The reason for this is that, economically speaking, people are a lot more willing to pay for an experience where you have a physical component. When it comes to learning, also because learning is hard, and because we're very irrational as to how we consume education, bringing the physical space back and making it a part of the equation, I think, will yield a much more better experience. Of course, it's yet to be defined what are going to be the sources of revenue. But in a sense, when we even look at companies like the University of Phoenix, it's almost like they're the old stuff, but in a sense, they got it right since the beginning, that what they've been doing is figuring out ways of reducing the cost of capital in terms of teachers. They also reduce the cost of having a physical space. Unfortunately, their digital offers are pretty mediocre. But in a sense, I think they figured out the economics of how to be able to deliver quality education that has the potential to be high quality education. So my assumption is that in the future, we're actually going to see mergers between companies that are solely about the software with companies that are solely about the physical space. And I perceive that as being the future of this space. That's what I have. If anyone has questions or comments, or do we have time for?
So, Jose, this is clearly a space that's very personal to me as well. I'm an advisor with Skillshare. Mm-hmm. And one of the things I often see in the rise of education platforms is that they tend to take a media approach, which is connect the source of content with the consumption of content. Whereas in education, one part is that you need to learn something to build your skills, but the other part is that you need to be accredited and get a currency that can be traded for something in the market.
Yep.
And that's why people would still come to an MIT and would not necessarily go to a Skillshare or a Udemy. So where do you think the future of platforms lies with respect to accreditation, and what do you think would differentiate those who can crack that problem from those who can't?
So I think it's, at the end of the day, it's when we think about like institutions and when we think about what's legitimate at an institution, it's kind of hard, right? Because like if you come to MIT, right, there's like all these beautiful buildings, there are all these smart people, but in a sense we believe in this. Like in a sense, it's that we all come together and think, well, having a degree from MIT means something. The question is, how can you actually get people to trust new entities and say, oh, well, this new entity, we're going to go with this new entity because we think that it's a legitimate institution and it really means something, right? It's, in a sense, it's signal of quality. Because I guess an MIT is sort of like a great example, right? Because like a lot of the classes are available online. So you can literally take, I think for some majors, you can literally take most of the classes online. All you get is a certificate that has no real value. But in a sense, that's a recognition that there's a difference between the knowledge that you can get and then the experience of going sort of like through the machine. And then to me, more the question of success in the long run is whether companies or nonprofits can really convince society that sort of like new ways of certifying knowledge, whether that's a legitimate or not legitimate. Like, are we okay? Like, because we have, thousands of universities in the US, is that good enough? Like, is the market willing to tolerate sort of like a new era of people that, bringing new stamps? Which is kind of funny, right? Because if you look even at the for-profit universities, part of the reason that they're able to compete in the same space is because they're accredited. Like, literally, if you think of it, it's almost like the medallions in taxis, right? That literally there are all these companies looking for struggling colleges. They want to buy the assets, but the asset that's the most important part, it's not the building, it's not the people. It's the fact that they're regionally accredited. So by having that stamp, even if the education is very shitty, they're still accredited. And as a result of that, it becomes legitimized. So the question to me in the future is, are we going to stay in a system like that, where you have all these regional institutions that in a sense validate what you do, or whether we're going to be like, no, we can trust, the Coursera's of the world and the Duolingos of the world.
Riffing off what you just said, there's the whole element of the experience of going through the engine. Mm-hmm. And a very important part of being part of an educational institution is the peer learning that's involved. How do you see that being replicated on platforms going forward?
Wow. That's really a function of what is the scope and what are the economics behind these platforms. Most of these platforms have gone for aggregation. So the model has been, let's get millions of users, and then let's figure out how to actually generate money. I don't see enough efforts into really saying, well, how about if we only take 1,000 students a year or 100 students a year and actually charge them tuition and see what happens. So the interaction part to me is that we went for the model of let's get to millions of users and then we'll figure it out. Because in a sense, like that's been sort of the history of the internet, right? It's businesses are built based on get eyeballs, and once you have eyeballs, then you'll figure it out how to do something. The reality is that at the end of the day, the sustainability of companies is a function of you generating revenue somehow. And when it comes to education, the asset itself is expensive. It's not like you can just say, we're going to give it out for free and it's going to be as good as any other type of asset. So it's an asset that, in a sense, we're sort of like misrepresenting as to what it is.
Great. We have 5 more minutes, so we'll take a few questions.
So you pose a very interesting question on how is it going to evolve. The way I actually see it, the tipping point is large companies that are doing the hiring. When they decide to hire on skill versus a degree, mm-hmm. that will accelerate that whole process. And as a matter of fact, one of the things we're doing, I'm part of a very big company, is there's some skills that we can't find. Mm-hmm. So we're looking for talent, and we're actually even hiring people that don't even have a college degree because they have this very specific skill. Yep. So that whole thing is moving. So I think that's a kind of a tipping point function. Yeah,
and that's, of course, a good point, that ultimately the question of this, the staple that you get going to a school, like what's the meaning, like beyond having the experience? I mean, are you going to school to get a job? Or, for example, I was educated at liberal arts college, so I was like unemployable by the time I went to this hippie school. Well, the caveat there is that I went to this hippie school in Western Massachusetts that has no grades, no exams, no majors. So, of course, it was a completely different thing. But also, I think that there's this question of, like, what is the purpose of education? Of course, underneath all this is the fact that the US as an economy, it's not an economy that's going in the right direction, right? So in a sense, all these questions about, like, what is the value of education and, like, should I go and get a degree, is it worth it, is more a reflection that, economically speaking, justifying, $200,000 in 4 years of your life, you will just not be able to pay it back. However, that's not to say that there are other countries around the world where the economies are actually growing, and assets like this, like spending 4 years at college studying philosophy, that society as a whole can support individuals that go ahead and have this type of experiences. So in a sense, to your point, it's almost like now education in the US has become a commodity. Like, you have it as a tax that you have to pay in order to hope that you get a job. But it's almost like the problem is not in academia, the problem is really in the economy.
Okay. So part of the genius of the Duolingo business model is that you turn students into mechanical Turks. So how did you determine that it could work and produce quality? It's interesting because we'll be able to see maybe how generalizable this is to other tasks, as you mentioned.
Testing. This started from the assumption that it could be done, and over time just iterating and iterating until we got to the point where it's like, oh, look, it works. So from that perspective, is pure research. I don't think that it's one of those spaces where you can, it's more about digging and finding the opportunities. For example, there's this other company called Human DX, and basically what they're doing is that it's for, what they want to figure it out is when it comes to diseases. So you get someone in the hospital, and this, he or she represents, high fever or like all these components. The question is, how do you diagnose what's going on? So what this guy's built is this game where basically you have doctors and medical students play these games where they're given a set of symptoms and they have to come up with what they believe is the sickness. It turns out to be extremely efficient, right? Because if you're a student, a med student, you're gonna have to take a test where you have to say, based on this criteria, what do you think this patient has? Now, if you make this massive, so you can get literally thousands of med students doing this, then over time, by having all these entries, you actually start discovering sort of like different symptoms when they come together, whether you represent. So there's definitely a lot of space for figuring out, pretty much killing two birds with one stone. I guess the question is, who's interested in solving these types of problems and just finding the solution? Because it's almost like you have to have this aha moment when you realize, like, oh, I can go to the gym, and while I'm at the gym, so the friction I generate, that can be captured by batteries. Like it's not as simple as like, there's a problem, here's a solution. So.
One last question. Hi, Beth Porter from edX. One of the things that that this diagram really speaks to me about is the physical or the connections that I think is really a lot of what maybe you or many others of us have really remembered or taken away from our own college learning, which is that you're in a place with other people and you feel this really tight connection with them because of proximity. And it's not the learning always that happens in the classroom, but it's what you learn from the student sitting next to you in the dining facility or on the lawn or wherever you're congregating. And I think one of the challenges that we definitely are trying to take on is how to replicate that and how to make that be what the online environment is, or as you've sort of outlined here in this diagram, find a way to get people to get back to physical connection somehow. So I just wonder if you could comment a little bit on that and how you see that playing itself out, particularly through mobile devices or sort of finding people literally in that network.
So to me, my argument it's more as a value. I mean, ultimately, sure, it's nice to be staring at a screen, but ultimately, I think quality of time and quality of life really comes from us being social beings. And the fact that we're spending less and less time with other beings, it's not a good thing. And this is just a value system. I don't view it as, maybe I'm not even able to actually show it through data. So it's more of my perception is that I want to live in a world and a society where we appreciate the fact that we come together and we share as humans. Sure, is that efficient? Is that part of the evolutionary process? I don't know, but I guess I'm just human, and that's my agenda. So that's. Thank you. Thank you very much.